I had been working the night shift at Walmart for about 3 months when it happened. They call it the graveyard shift. And let me tell you, it earns its name in more ways than one. The hours between midnight and 6 a.m. are strange enough with their eerie silence, empty aisles, and flickering fluorescent lights. But that particular night, it became something else entirely. It started like any other shift. The store was quiet, save for the hum of the freezers and the occasional squeak of my coworker Steve's cleaning cart. He was in his usual spot near the cleaning supplies aisle, muttering something to himself while I restocked shelves in the toy section. Around 2:15 a.m., I noticed something odd. A single Barbie doll was lying in the middle of the aisle. Now, I'd already gone through that section earlier, and I distinctly remembered putting all the dolls in their rightful places. Shrugging it off as Steve's idea of a prank, I picked it up and placed it back on the shelf. Minutes later, I heard a faint giggle. I froze. It wasn't Steve's voice. This was a child's laugh. Soft, high-pitched, and coming from somewhere nearby. My heart began to race as I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The only response was the low hum of the air conditioning. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe just my tired mind playing tricks. But then, as I turned back to the shelf, every single Barbie doll tumbled off, landing in a chaotic pile at my feet. "Nope," I muttered under my breath, stepping back. I was done with that aisle for the night. I headed over to the electronics section, figuring I'd kill some time organizing the DVDs. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The aisles stretched out like endless corridors, and every shadow seemed to flicker and shift as I passed. When I reached the electronics section, the TVs were all on, displaying the usual Walmart promo loop. I had just started straightening the racks of DVDs when, one by one, the TVs switched to static. The hissing sound filled the air, sharp and invasive. Then, just as quickly, they all went black. And then, the whispering started. It was faint at first, like a breeze rustling through leaves, but it grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every direction. My name was in there somewhere, whispered over and over, distorted and warped. Jake, come play with us." My blood ran cold. I dropped the stack of DVDs I was holding and backed away, my breathing shallow. "Steve?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "If this is you, man, it's not funny." But deep down, I knew this wasn't Steve. I bolted out of the electronics section, making a beeline for the front of the store. I needed to find him, to find someone, anyone. The aisles seemed longer than usual, stretching into infinity, and the lights above flickered ominously. As I passed the produce section, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, standing near the bananas, was a little girl. She looked no older than 6, wearing a tattered white dress that seemed oddly out of place. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her dark hair hung limp around her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Hey," I said, my voice trembling. "What are you doing here? Are you lost?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed toward the toy section. Her lips parted slightly, and she whispered, "Come play." That was enough for me. I turned and sprinted toward the employee break room, my heart hammering in my chest. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pressing down on me. When I reached the door, I threw it open and slammed it shut behind me. "Steve!" I shouted, but the break room was empty. Steve's cleaning cart was parked outside, but there was no sign of him. I pulled out my phone to call him, only to find that my screen was glitching, the image warping and distorting before the device shut off completely. And then I heard it. The sound of tiny footsteps echoing just outside the break room door. I backed up against the wall, my pulse pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft knock. I didn't dare move. Another knock, louder this time, and then the door creaked open slowly. The little girl stood in the doorway, her head tilted to one side. Her eyes were darker now, empty voids that seemed to pierce straight through me. She smiled, a twisted, unnatural grin that made my stomach churn. "Why won't you play with me?" she asked, her voice echoing unnaturally. I didn't respond. I couldn't. My legs refused to move, frozen in place as she took a step closer. The lights flickered violently, and the walls of the break room seemed to close in around me. And then, just as she reached out a hand, the store's PA system crackled to life. "Attention associates," a calm, robotic voice announced. "The store will be closing early tonight. Please complete your tasks and exit promptly." The girl froze, her smile vanishing. She glared at the ceiling, her expression twisted with rage before vanishing into thin air. One moment she was there, and the next, she was gone. The lights returned to normal, and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. I stumbled out of the break room, my knees weak. Steve was standing near the registers, looking confused but unharmed. "Dude, where were you?" I asked, my voice shaky. He frowned. "I was cleaning the bathrooms. Why?" I didn't know how to explain what I just experienced, so I didn't try. I grabbed my things, clocked out, and left without another word. I quit the next day. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't worth sticking around to find out more. Sometimes I still hear that giggle in the back of my mind when I'm alone late at night, and I never go to Walmart after dark anymore. Story the end.
Story number 2.
I never thought working at Walmart could be scary. Boring, sure. Exhausting, definitely. But scary? That was something I didn't expect. At least, not until the night I found the forgotten aisle. It was a slow Tuesday on the night shift. Most of the store was empty except for a few late-night shoppers and my coworkers. I was assigned to Zone 7, the back of the store near the storage area, to restock some shelves. Easy enough, right? Around 1 a.m., I noticed something strange. At the very end of the storage corridor, where the bright fluorescent lights didn't quite reach, there was an aisle I'd never seen before. The shelves were tall and dusty, and the flickering sign above read, "Clearance." It wasn't on the map of my section, and I was sure it hadn't been there earlier that week. Curious, and maybe a little bored, I decided to check it out. As I walked closer, the air grew colder, and the faint hum of the store's sound system seemed to fade. The aisle was poorly lit, the overhead bulbs buzzing faintly like they were struggling to stay alive. The shelves were lined with strange items. Not your usual clearance stuff like broken toys or out-of-season decorations. These were old, weathered objects. Porcelain dolls with cracked faces, ancient books with titles I couldn't read, and dusty mirrors that reflected the aisle in warped, unsettling ways. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I shook it off. I grabbed my walkie and called in. "Hey, does anyone know about the clearance aisle in the back? I don't remember it being here." Static. "Steve? Mary? Anyone?" Still nothing. Annoyed, I shoved the walkie back into my pocket and started down the aisle. The floor creaked under my boots, and the further I walked, the darker it seemed to get. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, like the sound was coming from somewhere far behind me. Then I saw it. A small wooden box sitting on the middle shelf. It was plain, with a faded carving on the lid, but something about it drew me in. My fingers hovered over it, and just as I reached out, I heard a voice behind me. "Don't touch that." I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. A woman was standing there. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with wild gray hair and eyes that seemed too bright for the dim aisle. I hadn't heard her walk up, and I had no idea how she'd gotten there. Sorry, I didn't mean to," I stammered, stepping back. She shook her head, her expression grim. "You shouldn't be here. This aisle, it isn't for you." "What do you mean?" "I work here," I said, trying to sound confident, though my voice wavered. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner before I could ask any more questions. Now, any sane person would have left right then. But something about that box kept pulling at me, like a magnetic force I couldn't resist. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. The moment I did, the lights above flickered violently and a low, guttural noise filled the air. It wasn't coming from the speakers or the floor. It was coming from the box. "Help us," a voice whispered, faint and raspy. It sounded like it came from a dozen throats, all speaking in unison. My hands shook as I tried to put the box back, but it wouldn't leave my grip. It was like it was glued to my palms. Then the shadows moved. I swear they weren't just tricks of the light. They slithered along the shelves, growing taller, darker, and more defined with each passing second. The air turned icy, and I could see my breath in front of me as the whispering grew louder. I bolted. Clutching the box, I ran back down the aisle, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't find the end. The shelves stretched endlessly, and the buzzing of the lights above became deafening. I screamed for help, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. Suddenly, the woman was there again, stepping out from the shadows as if they'd summoned her. Her bright eyes locked onto the box, and she reached out, her expression urgent. "Give it to me?" she demanded. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the box into her hands, and the moment she touched it, the air changed. The lights flickered back to life, and the aisle began to fade, replaced by the familiar layout of the store. The woman's face softened, and for a moment I thought I saw tears in her eyes. "You're lucky you got out," she said quietly. "Others weren't so fortunate." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and disappeared again. This time, I didn't try to follow. I ran straight to the front of the store, Found my manager and told him everything. He looked at me like I was crazy. "What aisle?" "There's no clearance aisle in the back," he said, pulling out the store map to show me. Sure enough, the spot where I'd been was just marked as storage space. I quit that same night. Whatever that aisle was, it wasn't supposed to exist. And whatever that box was, it wasn't meant for this world. Every now and then, when I drive past that Walmart, I think about the woman, the shadows, and the whispering voices. I wonder how many other night shifters have found the forgotten aisle and if they were as lucky as I was. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was my third week working the night shift at Walmart. Everyone warned me about the strange things that happen after midnight, but I shrugged it off. Ghost stories, rumors, urban legends, they're all just ways to make the job more interesting. Or so I thought. That night, my task was to restock the freezer section. It was colder than usual, even for a freezer. My breath hung in the air like smoke, and the light above flickered constantly. I grabbed my cart of frozen goods and started arranging pizzas on the shelves, trying to work quickly so I could warm up. I had just finished stacking a row of chicken nuggets when I heard a faint thud. I froze, listening carefully. It came again, thud, thud, like something knocking from the other side of the freezer door. I stepped back, staring at the glass. There was nothing there, just the frosty shelves lined with neatly arranged packages. Shrugging it off, I grabbed another box and turned to place it on the shelf. That's when I saw it, a handprint. It was on the inside of the freezer door, pressed against the fogged glass. The shape was small, like a child's hand, and the frost seemed to melt around it as if it were fresh. My stomach twisted, and I instinctively glanced behind me, but I was alone in the aisle. "Steve? Mary? Anyone back there?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed my walkie. "Hey, is anyone in the freezer section? Something weird's going on." Static. Then, faintly, a voice crackled through. "Help me." It wasn't anyone I recognized. The voice was faint, strained, and it sent chills racing down my spine. Before I could respond, the walkie fell silent again. I backed away from the freezer, my heart racing. That's when the lights in the entire section flickered and went out. The hum of the freezers grew louder, almost deafening, as the temperature seemed to plummet even further. My breath came out in rapid puffs of white. And then I saw her. A little girl stood at the end of the aisle, her figure barely visible in the dim light. She was wearing a tattered dress, and her head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Her face was pale, almost bluish, like she'd been pulled straight out of an icebox. "Are you okay?" I managed to whisper, my voice catching in my throat. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised one hand and pointed directly at me. That's when the freezer doors slammed open all at once. Packages of food tumbled to the floor, the temperature dropping even further. I stumbled backward, slipping on a bag of frozen peas, and landed hard on the cold tile. The girl moved closer, but her feet didn't touch the ground. She seemed to glide, her empty eyes locked on mine. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally in the empty aisle. "I don't know what you're talking about," I stammered, scrambling to my feet. She reached out toward me, her hand impossibly cold as it brushed against my arm. Images flooded my mind. Flashes of snow, an abandoned car, and a little girl pounding on a locked door. It wasn't my memory, but it felt as real as if it had been. "I didn't mean to," I said, tears stinging my eyes, though I didn't know why. "I wasn't there." Her expression twisted with anger, and the lights flickered violently. The freezer doors began to slam open and shut, the sound echoing like gunshots. The air grew so cold that my fingers went numb, and I could barely feel my legs as I tried to move. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I screamed and spun around, only to see Steve staring at me, his face pale. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted over the chaos. I turned back to the aisle, but the girl was gone. The freezer doors were closed, the lights steady, and the aisle was eerily silent. It was like nothing had happened at all. I saw something," I stammered, my breath still coming in ragged gasps. Steve shook his head. "You've been standing here for 15 minutes, staring at the freezers. Are you okay?" I didn't know how to explain what had just happened. My arm still felt cold where she'd touched me, and I couldn't shake the memory that wasn't mine. I finished my shift that night, but I avoided the freezer section as much as possible. When I finally went home, I did some digging online trying to make sense of what I'd seen. That's when I found it, an article from 10 years ago about a little girl who died in that very Walmart. She had wandered into the back storage freezer and gotten locked inside. By the time anyone found her, it was too late. The photo in the article sent shivers down my spine. It was her, the same girl I'd seen in the aisle. I quit the next day. No job is worth seeing that kind of thing again. But sometimes when I'm in a grocery store, I swear I can feel the air grow colder, and I catch a glimpse of a small handprint on the glass. And I always leave before she finds me again. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was supposed to be an ordinary night shift at Walmart, but nothing about that night was ordinary. My job was simple: clean up the store, restock shelves, and help the occasional customer. By 11 p.m., the store was nearly empty, and the eerie silence of the vast aisles had started to set in. Around midnight, I was assigned to the clothing section. It was my least favorite area because of the mannequins. Something about them always felt off. The blank, lifeless faces, the stiff postures. They were just too human-like for comfort. That night, the mannequins felt even worse. As I folded a pile of shirts, I noticed one of the mannequins near the entrance to the section had moved. I didn't see it happen, but I was sure it wasn't in that position earlier. Its head was tilted slightly, facing me. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe one of the other employees had bumped it. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. "Relax, it's just a mannequin," I muttered to myself. I went back to folding clothes, but out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement. I glanced up, and the mannequin's arm was raised, pointing directly at me. My stomach dropped. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light or my imagination. Taking a deep breath, I walked over to it, determined to prove to myself that nothing was wrong. Its blank, featureless face seemed to mock me as I stood inches away. I reached out and gently pushed the arm back into place. "There. Fixed," I said, my voice trembling. I turned to leave, but I froze mid-step. The mannequin's head had turned, now facing me again. My heart pounded as I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a display stand. "Okay, this isn't funny," I called out, hoping one of my coworkers was playing a prank. But no one answered. I grabbed my walkie and radioed in. "Hey, is anyone messing around in the clothing section? The mannequins are acting weird." Static. Then a faint, garbled response. "Get out." I couldn't tell who it was, but the voice sounded distorted, like it was coming from a tunnel. The walkie cut out before I could respond. The lights in the section flickered, and when they came back on, my heart nearly stopped. The mannequin had moved. It was no longer standing by the entrance. It was now in the center of the aisle, its head tilted and its arms outstretched, as if reaching for me. I backed away slowly, my breathing rapid. The air in the store felt heavier, colder, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mannequin. And then it stepped forward. Not a smooth movement like a sliding prop or a rolling platform. It stepped. One rigid, unnatural leg at a time, guessed like it was learning how to walk. I bolted. I ran toward the front of the store, my footsteps echoing in the empty aisles. As I rounded the corner near the toy section, I caught a glimpse of another mannequin. This one was standing at the end of the aisle, blocking my path. Its posture was identical. Arms outstretched, head tilted. But its face was cracked, the empty void of its eyes seeming to follow me. I turned and ran the other way, only to find more mannequins waiting for me. They were everywhere now, positioned at the ends of every aisle. Their blank faces and stiff bodies formed a maze, trapping me in the center of the store. "Help!" I screamed, but my voice seemed to vanish into the vast emptiness. The mannequins began to close in, their movements jerky and unnatural. The sound of their plastic feet scraping against the tile floor was unbearable, like nails on a chalkboard. I ducked into the break room, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath. The room was dimly lit, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But then, the lights flickered. When they came back on, a single mannequin stood in the corner of the room. It wasn't there before. Its head was tilted, and in its hand was my name tag, which I'd lost earlier in the shift. "How?" I whispered, backing into the far wall. The mannequin stepped forward, the sound of its plastic joints cracking echoing in the small room. Its face began to change, the smooth surface splitting and shifting until it formed a twisted mockery of my own face. I screamed. The next thing I remember, I was outside the store. My coworkers found me sitting on the curb near the parking lot, shivering and pale. I tried to explain what happened, but they didn't believe me. The security cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary, and when we checked the clothing section, all the mannequins were back in their usual places. I quit that night, but sometimes I still dream about them. In those dreams, I'm back in the store, surrounded by mannequins. They whisper my name in voices that sound like mine, and their faces, twisted and cracked, are always watching. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The janitor's warning. I took the overnight shift at Walmart because I needed the money, and the pay was better after dark. The hours were long, and the store was eerily quiet after midnight, but it wasn't anything I couldn't handle. At least, that's what I thought. It started on a Tuesday, one of the slowest nights of the week. I was assigned to clean up the grocery section, organizing stray items, and sweeping the floors. Around 2 a.m., I saw the janitor, Earl, mopping near the refrigerated aisles. Earl was an older guy, probably in his late 60s, with deep lines on his face and a permanent scowl. He barely talked to anyone, but that night, he called me over. "You shouldn't be here after 3 a.m., he said, his voice low and gravelly. I frowned. "What are you talking about? My shift ends at 6. Earl shook his head, his eyes narrowing. "You don't understand. There's something in this store. Something that doesn't like people being here too late." I laughed nervously, thinking he was messing with me. "Okay, Earl, sure thing. I'll keep that in mind." But his expression didn't change. He looked dead serious. "You think I'm joking? Ask anyone who's been here long enough. They won't talk about it, but they know." Before I could ask him to explain, he pushed his mop bucket toward the back storage area and disappeared into the shadows. I brushed it off as the ramblings of an old man and went back to work. But as the clock crept closer to 3 a.m., the atmosphere in the store shifted. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder, the aisles darker, and the faint sound of the PA system playing soft elevator music felt distorted, almost like it was underwater. I was restocking cans in the soup aisle when I heard a loud crash from the next aisle over. My heart jumped, and I dropped the can in my hand. "Earl?" I called, but there was no answer. Cautiously, I stepped into the next aisle, but it was empty. A dozen cans of beans were scattered across the floor, as if someone had swiped them off the shelf. I sighed, thinking maybe a shelf bracket had given way. As I bent down to pick up the cans, I heard it. A whisper. At first I thought it was coming from the PA system, but the sound was too close, too distinct. It was soft and raspy, like someone was right behind me, murmuring words I couldn't understand. I spun around, but no one was there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. Just the steady hum of the lights above and the faint creak of the building settling. I told myself I was imagining things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I turned a corner, I thought I saw something moving just out of sight. A shadow darting across the floor, the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the distance. Then I heard Earl's voice over the walkie. "Get out of the store. Now." My blood ran cold. Earl never used the walkies unless it was an emergency. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling, static. "Earl?" "Too late," his voice crackled through, barely audible. "It's coming." The lights flickered and the air grew colder. I looked around, trying to figure out what he meant, and that's when I saw it. At the end of the aisle, a figure stood in the shadows. It was tall and thin, unnaturally so, its limbs elongated like it had been stretched. Its face, or what should have been its face, was blank, smooth like a mannequin with no features. It tilted its head as if studying me, and then it moved. Not walked. Moved. One moment it was at the end of the aisle, and the next it was closer, its body jerking unnaturally like a glitch in a video. I dropped the cans and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I sprinted toward the front of the store, but the aisles seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways they shouldn't. The figure was always just behind me, its movements silent but impossibly fast. When I finally reached the front doors, they wouldn't open. I slammed my hands against the glass, screaming for help, but the parking lot outside was empty, the world beyond the store eerily still. The figure appeared again, this time standing in the middle of the checkout lanes. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating, the air around it heavy and cold. "Don't look at it," Earl's voice came through the walkie again, barely more than a whisper. "Whatever you do, don't look." I turned away, squeezing my eyes shut and backing against the door. The sound of its jerky movements grew louder, closer, until it was right behind me. And then, nothing. I opened my eyes, and the store was normal again. The lights were steady, the aisles were quiet, and the front doors slid open with a soft whoosh. Earl was waiting outside, leaning against his mop. He didn't say anything, just gave me a knowing look and nodded toward the parking lot. I didn't ask questions. I walked straight to my car, started the engine, and didn't look back. The next day, I called in and quit. Whatever was in that store, it wasn't something I wanted to face again. Sometimes late at night, I think about Earl's warning and wonder how many people stayed past 3 a.m. and how many never made it out. Story the end.
Story number 6.
Walmart at night is a strange place. The bright lights and empty aisles make it feel like a labyrinth, and the silence is deafening. I had just started my shift as a night stalker, and on my third night, something happened that still haunts me. I was assigned to aisle 14, the home goods section, to organize a shipment of mirrors. It was a quiet night, with only a few customers wandering around. The stack of mirrors was surprisingly heavy, and it took me a while to get them all on the shelves. As I worked, I noticed something odd. Every time I turned my back to the mirrors, I felt like I was being watched. At first, I laughed it off. "It's just your imagination," I told myself, but the feeling wouldn't go away. When I turned around to face the mirrors, I saw nothing unusual, just my reflection in the aisle behind me. Still, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. Around 2 a.m., things started getting weird. I was crouched down, placing a mirror on the bottom shelf when I noticed movement in the reflection. It wasn't me. It was someone else. I shot up and spun around, but the aisle was empty. I stared into the mirror, my heart racing. The reflection showed only me and the shelves behind me. I let out a nervous laugh. "I'm just tired," I muttered. Then it happened again. This time, I saw a figure standing at the far end of the aisle in the mirror. It was a woman, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her long, dark hair hung over her face, and she was wearing a dirty, tattered dress. I whipped around, but the aisle was empty. When I looked back into the mirror, she was closer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The woman in the mirror tilted her head further, her hair parting just enough to reveal pale, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I blinked, and she was gone. I stumbled away from the mirror, nearly tripping over my cart. Grabbing my walkie, I called my coworker. "Hey, Steve, are you near aisle 14? I think someone's here." Static. Then a faint voice crackled through. "Shouldn't have touched the mirrors." "What, Steve? What are you talking about?" I shouted, but the walkie went silent. The lights flickered, and the temperature seemed to drop. I turned toward the mirrors again, and my stomach dropped. My reflection wasn't moving. I raised my hand. The reflection didn't. Instead, it smiled. I stumbled backward, unable to tear my eyes away. The reflection stepped forward, reaching out as if it were trying to break through the glass. I ran, leaving my cart behind. My shoes squeaked on the tile floor as I bolted down the aisles, my breath coming in panicked gasps. When I reached the electronics section, I stopped to catch my breath, glancing over my shoulder. The aisle was empty. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I saw her again, in the black screen of a TV on display. She wasn't behind me. She was in the screen, her face pressed against the glass as if she were trying to claw her way out. I screamed and ran toward the break room, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, ready to call the manager, but before I could dial, the lights in the room flickered and went out. The only light came from the small mirror above the sink in the corner of the room. In its reflection, I saw her again, standing right behind me. Her cold breath brushed against the back of my neck as she whispered, "You shouldn't have touched the mirrors." I blacked out. When I woke up, it was morning. The store manager was standing over me, looking concerned. "Are you okay? We found you passed out in the break room." I stammered something about being tired, but I didn't mention the woman or the mirrors. When I walked back to aisle 14 to retrieve my cart, the mirrors were gone. The shelves were completely empty, as if they'd never been there. I quit that same day. Now, whenever I see a mirror, I avoid looking too long. I can't help but wonder if she's still in there, waiting for someone else to touch the wrong one. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The overnight shift at Walmart always felt off, like the store existed in some strange liminal space after midnight. I didn't mind the quiet, though. It meant fewer customers and more time to work in peace. But the locker room, that was a different story. The locker room was tucked in the back, a cramped, poorly lit space where employees stored their belongings and took breaks. From the first night I worked there, I hated going inside. The air always felt heavy, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the walls no matter how often it was cleaned. One night, around 1:30 a.m., I needed to grab my jacket from my locker. The temperature in the store had dropped suddenly, and I wasn't about to freeze while stocking the freezer section. As I pushed open the door to the locker room, the fluorescent light above flickered erratically, casting strange shadows that danced across the dingy tiles. I stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind me. The sound echoed unnaturally, making the small space feel even more claustrophobic. Rows of lockers lined the walls, most of them scratched and dented from years of use. My locker was near the back, next to the supply closet that no one ever used. As I turned the dial on the lock, I heard a faint noise behind me, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I froze. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was probably just the air vent or some loose pipes. I grabbed my jacket and slammed the locker shut, eager to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, I caught something in the corner of my eye. The supply closet door was slightly ajar. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. That door was always locked. Maintenance had mentioned the lock was broken, but no one ever went inside. The shadows around the crack in the door seemed darker than they should have been, almost like they were alive. "Is someone in there?" I asked, my voice trembling. The door creaked open a little more, and the tapping started again, closer this time. My heart pounded as I took a step back, gripping my jacket like a shield. Then I saw it. A pale hand with long, bony fingers reached out from the darkness of the closet. The fingers were too long, the joints bent at unnatural angles. They gripped the edge of the door, pulling it open inch by inch. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. The rest of the figure emerged, a tall, emaciated shape that barely looked human. Its skin was gray and stretched tight over its bones, and its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. It tilted its head, a guttural clicking sound coming from deep within its throat. I bolted for the door, my sneakers squeaking against the tile floor. But the door wouldn't budge. It felt like something was holding it shut from the other side. I pounded on it, screaming for help, but my voice seemed to disappear into the oppressive silence of the locker room. Behind me, the clicking grew louder. I turned, my back pressed against the door. The thing was closer now, moving with jerky, unnatural motions, like a puppet on invisible strings. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine as it reached out with those grotesque fingers. Desperation took over. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a metal folding chair, and swung it at the creature. The chair went straight through it, as if it were made of smoke. The thing didn't even flinch. Suddenly, the lights in the locker room flickered violently, plunging the room into brief intervals of complete darkness. Each time the light came back on, the creature was closer. First, it was by the closet. Then, in the middle of the room. Then, right in front of me. In the final flicker of light, it was gone. The door behind me flew open, and I fell backward into the hallway. Gasping for air, I scrambled to my feet and looked around. The locker room was silent and empty, just as it had been when I first walked in. "Are you okay?" A voice startled me. It was Brian, one of the managers. He stood at the end of the hallway, looking concerned. I saw something," I stammered. "In the locker room. There's something in there." Brian's face darkened. He glanced toward the locker room door, then back at me. "You didn't open the supply closet, did you?" "I didn't touch it," I said quickly. "But it was already open." He muttered something under his breath and shook his head. "You're lucky. Just don't go in there again." Before I could press him for answers, he walked away, leaving me standing in the cold, empty hallway. I quit the next day. Whatever was lurking in that locker room, I didn't want to find out. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that tapping sound echoing in my mind like a terrible warning. Story the end.
Story number 8.
I'd been working the night shift at Walmart for a couple of weeks, and the quiet hours between midnight and dawn were starting to feel normal. Most nights were uneventful. Just me, a few coworkers, and the occasional insomniac shopper. But there was one part of the store I always avoided when I could. The garden center. Something about it felt wrong after dark. The air was colder there, even in the summer, and the shadows cast by the racks of pots and tools seemed to move when you weren't looking. But I didn't believe the stories, at least not until that night. It was a slow Wednesday, and my manager, Gina, sent me to clean up a spill in the garden center. I grabbed a mop and bucket, trying not to roll my eyes. I didn't want to go back there, but I also didn't want to lose my job. The garden center was dark except for a few flickering lights. Most of the plants were gone, replaced by empty racks and a few scattered bags of soil. The spill was near the far end by the display of ceramic planters. As I mopped, the quiet settled in around me, thick and oppressive. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and low, coming from the far corner of the garden center. It sounded like a woman, but her words were garbled like she was speaking through water. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the concrete floor. The voice stopped. I told myself it was probably just a customer who had wandered in, but when I looked around, the garden center was empty. I went back to mopping, but the voice started again, closer this time. I couldn't make out what it was saying, but the tone was pleading, almost desperate. "Is someone there?" I asked, my heart pounding. The voice stopped again, replaced by the faint rustling of plastic. I turned toward the sound and saw a bag of potting soil fall from a shelf, hitting the ground with a dull thud. My pulse quickened as I approached, my eyes scanning the dimly lit space for any sign of movement. At first, I thought she was a customer, standing by the rack of garden tools, her back to me. She was dressed in a long, pale dress that looked soaked, clinging to her thin frame. Her hair was dark and matted, dripping onto the floor. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. I took a cautious step closer. "The store is closed. If you need help, I can." She turned. Her face was wrong, pale and bloated like it had been underwater for too long. Her eyes were empty sockets, dark and hollow, and her mouth hung open as if she were trying to scream, but no sound came out. I stumbled backward, dropping the mop. The woman tilted her head, her movements slow and jerky, and then she raised her hand, pointing toward the far end of the garden center. I didn't wait to see what she wanted. I ran. As I sprinted toward the main store, the voice started again, louder this time, echoing all around me. It was no longer garbled. It was a clear, bone-chilling scream. I burst through the double doors into the main aisles, gasping for air. My coworker Jake was stocking shelves nearby and looked up, startled. "Dude, what's wrong?" he asked. There's someone in the garden center." I managed to choke out. Jake frowned. "The garden center's been locked up all night. No one's supposed to be back there." "I'm telling you, I saw her. She was..." I stopped mid-sentence, realizing how crazy I sounded. "Just come look." Reluctantly, Jake followed me back to the garden center. The air felt even colder now, and the faint smell of wet earth hung in the air. But the space was empty. No woman, no spilled soil, nothing. "You okay, man?" Jake asked, giving me a concerned look. I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the floor where the bag of soil had fallen earlier. The soil was back on the shelf, but in the faint layer of dust on the floor, I could see wet footprints leading from the rack of tools to the center of the room. Jake didn't seem to notice. He clapped me on the shoulder and walked off, shaking his head. I stayed behind, staring at the footprints until they started to fade, as if the water was being absorbed into the floor. I didn't go back to the garden center after that. A week later, I heard Gina talking to one of the other managers about a weird incident that happened years ago. A woman had drowned in the garden center's fish pond, back when the store still had one. They'd drained and removed the pond after the accident, but rumors about her ghost lingered. Now, when I pass by the garden center, I swear I can still hear her voice, soft and pleading, begging for someone to help her.
Story number 9.
Walmart's inventory room is a maze of metal shelves and towering boxes. During the day, it's just another part of the job, but at night, when the lights flicker and the hum of the store fades to an eerie silence, it's something else entirely. I had just started my overnight shift and was tasked with doing inventory in the back room. The list was long, and the clock ticked past midnight as I worked my way through rows of shelves. The inventory room always gave me an uneasy feeling, but I chalked it up to its sheer size and the way the towering racks made you feel small. I was counting boxes of detergent when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound from deeper in the room. I stopped, listening intently. "Hello?" I called out. Maybe it was one of my coworkers, but the room felt too still for that. No answer. The shuffling stopped. I shook my head and went back to counting, telling myself it was probably just the building settling or a stray rodent. But as I moved to the next row, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A box had been pulled from the top shelf and was now lying in the middle of the aisle. It wasn't there a moment ago. "Very funny," I said out loud, hoping whoever was messing with me would reveal themselves. "You can come out now." Silence. I picked up the box and placed it back on the shelf, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. But as I turned to leave, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Something darted between the shelves. It was too fast to see clearly, just a blur of shadow. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice echoing through the cavernous room. Nothing. I took a cautious step forward, peering down the next aisle. It was empty, but the uneasy feeling only grew stronger, like the walls were closing in around me. The fluorescent lights above flickered, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was soft and raspy, coming from the far corner of the room. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone or something was calling my name. Jake? I called, hoping it was my coworker playing a prank. If this is you, it's not funny. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. It was definitely my name, repeated over and over like a chant. My skin crawled as I followed the sound, each step heavier than the last. I turned the corner and froze. At the end of the aisle stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its body shrouded in darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe like smoke. Its head was tilted unnaturally to the side, and its glowing red eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The whispering grew deafening, filling my ears like a swarm of bees. The figure raised a hand, its long, bony fingers pointing directly at me. And then it started to move. Not walk, glide. Its movements were smooth and unnatural, as if it were floating just above the ground. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a stack of boxes. No, I whispered, my voice trembling. This can't be real. The lights above flickered violently, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the figure was gone. But the whispering wasn't. It was behind me now, so close I could feel the cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My pulse pounded in my ears as I bolted for the door, not caring about the inventory list or the boxes I knocked over in my panic. When I reached the door, it wouldn't open. I yanked on the handle, pounding on the metal with my fists. "Let me out!" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. The lights went out completely. In the pitch black, the whispering returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. It surrounded me, circling closer and closer, my name over and over until it felt like my mind would shatter. And then, silence. The lights flickered back on and the door clicked open. I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. My manager, Carla, was standing there, her brow furrowed. "What's going on? I heard you screaming." I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out. I just shook my head, my hands trembling. Carla sighed. "You're not the first to say something like this about the inventory room. Just take the rest of the night off." I didn't argue. I grabbed my things and left, vowing never to return to that room again. A week later, I quit. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't meant to be seen, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it wanted.
Story number 10.
It was close to 2 a.m., and I was working the graveyard shift at Walmart. Nights were usually uneventful, just a handful of customers and the occasional oddball. My station was near the self-checkout area, a spot that gave me a good view of the store's main floor while I kept an eye on the machines. That night, the store was unusually quiet. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound, broken occasionally by the robotic "please scan your item" voice from the self-checkout machines. I was leaning against the counter, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something on the security monitors. A woman. She was standing at one of the self-checkout machines, her back to the camera. She was tall and thin, wearing a long, outdated dress that looked like something from the 1800s. Her hair was tied in a loose bun, and her posture was stiff, almost unnatural. I frowned. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and the entrance doors hadn't chimed. The timestamp on the monitor showed she'd been standing there for over a minute, not moving. "Great," I muttered. "Another customer who doesn't know how to use the machines." I walked over to the self-checkout area, my footsteps echoing on the tile floor. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you need help with?" I stopped mid-sentence. She was gone. I looked around, confused. The machines were empty, the entire area deserted. I glanced back toward the security desk, where the monitors still showed her standing at the machine. "What the hell?" I whispered. A chill ran down my spine as I approached the machine she'd been using. The screen was glitching, flickering between the usual payment options and something else. A black screen with faint, white text scrolling too fast to read. I reached out to touch the screen, and as my fingers grazed the surface, the machine let out a piercing screech. I stumbled backward, covering my ears as the noise echoed through the empty store. And then it stopped. The screen went black for a moment before returning to the normal payment screen, as if nothing had happened. I stared at it, my heart racing. Maybe it was a glitch, I told myself, just some random error. But then I saw her again. This time, she was on the far side of the self-checkout area, standing perfectly still by the exit. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and sunken. She stared at me, unblinking, her head tilted slightly to the side. I opened my mouth to say something, but no sound came out. My legs felt rooted to the spot, my body frozen under her gaze. Slowly, she raised her arm and pointed to the self-checkout machine I'd just touched. I turned back to the machine, my stomach churning. The screen had changed again, displaying a single word in bold white letters: "Leave." When I looked back, she was gone. I didn't need any further convincing. I bolted toward the break room, grabbing my phone to call my manager. As I dialed, the store's lights began to flicker, casting the aisles in and out of shadow. The call went straight to voicemail. I leaned against the break room door, trying to steady my breathing. My hand was trembling so much I almost dropped my phone. That's when I heard it, a faint voice coming from the self-checkout area. "Scan your soul." The words were slow and drawn out, almost mechanical. I peeked out from the break room window and my blood ran cold. Every self-checkout machine was glitching, their screens flashing with distorted images. And standing in front of one of them, her hand resting on the scanner, was the woman. Her head snapped toward me, her dark eyes locking onto mine. She didn't move, but I could feel her presence, heavy and oppressive, as if the air itself was suffocating me. I didn't stick around to see what would happen next. I ran. I ran out of the break room, out of the store, and didn't stop until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life. The next morning, I tried to tell my manager about what had happened, but he just shook his head. "You're not the first," he said, his tone grim. "There have been stories about that self-checkout area for years. People see things, hear things, but it's just stories, right?" I quit that day. Even now, I can't walk into a Walmart without feeling that oppressive chill. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear a voice whispering, "Please scan your item." Story the end.